Hey guys, welcome back to Week's Worth. I'm Jared Scott. Again, going through our study of Genesis. Genesis 3 is right when we're still in the garden. We're still in the Garden of Eden. Everything's wonderful and perfect. And one of the questions I always thought about is, what is that perfection like? You know, one day we hope to experience it as we will enter into heaven one day. But right now, we just kind of imagine, you know, they would walk on green grass with no thorns. Living in Texas, we have lots of stickers everywhere. It's absolutely horrendous. It hurts so bad. Luckily, it's winter when we're shooting this, though I'm preparing for the summer. And it just kind of makes me mad to think Adam and Eve really messed this one up for us. And as we go through this study, though, and you start thinking about all the negatives that have come, and you always ask yourself the question, well, if I was there, would I have done the same thing? And sadly, I'm afraid the answer is probably yes. You know, in Genesis 3, it opens up with Eve by herself in the garden. The serpent comes, and it describes him as crafty. You know, a good lie is 90% true. That's a difficult thing to wrap our head around, of going, most of our lies are full of truth. If we can convince someone that we're mostly true, we can probably get them to believe the little white lie. And Satan tells Eve, as he tells us, these little white lies where, did God really say this? Did God really say that? Well, you surely will not die. It won't be that big of a deal. And I find it so funny because we're going to start seeing a theme past chapter 3 of sin is always at our door, and where are we keeping our eyes on? It's really easy to get distracted, and especially today with how many phones we have, everything at our fingertips, just the busyness of life in 2025 is so easy to get distracted and caught up that we don't recognize that sin is right in front of us. And we always say we would never do those things, but yet we, like Eve, listen and play in our mind different scenarios of, would we really die? Would I really become like who God is? Now, which is a bad translation, because what Satan actually says is you will become God. You'll become equal with him. And we ask the question, where's Adam at during this time? But we also begin to see another distraction from him of being maybe present physically, but absent in mind. And then we start seeing already the loose ends that come from human selfishness that God, one, did not create us to experience, but we kind of start seeing those temptations being brought up and we fall into them. And with that, the questions become, are we aware, or are we often present in physicality, but absent in mind? There's these dangers. I always tell people an absent father still has a large effect on a child's future, but so does a present father who's absent in mind have a long-standing effect on his family. And because of that, we see these two individuals, Adam and Eve, fall into sin, who they eat this tree because it lifts and elevates themselves to higher authority in their minds, rather than recognizing the gift that's all around them, right? Remember that God said, you can have everything here. Everything is under your authority except for this one tree. And they gave up all the beauty for 1 second of something that could be better. It's easy for us to get frustrated and blame them for so many things. But when you and I look at our own lives, do we often give up the gifts around us for the one thing that is not a sure win? And the problem is it looks beautiful. Sin looks good, right? The fruit looks good. It looks close to what we already have, but it could be better. And we often don't enjoy the gifts that are given, but we look for the next best thing. And because of that, we see the punishment come on Adam and Eve and the rest of the world, right? And it's interesting that, Satan's punishment is that the serpent will no longer be able to walk, but will slither for the rest of the world or rest of his days. and that he will bite the heel of man, but the heel of man will crush his head. Also, that is a really cool tattoo idea for those out there who are looking for tattoos. And when we get to Leviticus, we'll have fun with that idea. But for man and for woman, the punishment goes back to the beauty of what was created before sin, right? Again, as we talked about last week in Genesis 1 and 2, that man and woman were created to live in matrimony, in marriage, and holy, perfect marriage forever. And Eve's punishment is now that she'll be at odds with her husband, right? To take something that was perfectly made, and then the punishment of your sin, of her sin, is that we will now be at odds with one another. And then the next thing we see with Adam was made to create and to work the ground and do all those things. And then his punishment is now that sin has entered the world. Work will become hard. You have to labor for food, and labor will be hard, right? He will experience the thistles and weeds, as it says later on in a minute. And because of these two things, what we see pre-sin is now affected forever by sin. The community, the marriage, the connectivity between the two individuals has now put tension in our lives for the rest of the earthly endeavors that we're experiencing. Because of Adam's reluctance and ability to lead well, he has caused work to be toil. What's something that is meant to be joy, and we find purpose in life and more glory of who God is and our character through it, has now become, for the most part, typically mundane and difficult, and our joy goes down because of work. You know, as we think through Genesis 3 and the fall and sin entering the world, do we recognize where this comes from? And do we fight back towards it? Because of sin, we might go, I have to go to work today. Man, my spouse this. This thing here. And we complain more and more, but do we sit and rejoice in the fact that as soon as this sin happens, God goes, though you try to cover yourself, I will cover you in perfection. And I will make things right. The joy of thinking through of the punishment of Adam and Eve is knowing one day we'll be brought back right intent of what marriage is and what work is into our life, of what we see in Genesis 1 and 2 being destroyed in Genesis 3 will be brought back together here at the end of time. And so finding peace and working through these hard questions and hard, difficult things in just such a short passage is such a blessing. And, you know, you think about our fear and shame that Adam felt. If you go back and read chapter 3, when they ate the fruit, the first thing they did was they got fig leaves and covered themselves because they realized they were naked and they were ashamed. And I think, again, the beauty of what God does at the end of chapter 3 is he takes away their clothing that didn't actually cover them and clothes them for them, that actually covers them and protects them and shields them. And I think this is where you see God in his righteous anger also show grace and mercy so quickly. The beauty is, as soon as God is introduced and as soon as we get to know who God's character is, even in the frustration, we see God's care and forgiveness for his people. And the biggest question for you and I is, do we seek God's care and grace for his people? It's easy to get caught up in the shiny object and the punishment, but do we look for the correction and the hope provided by God in the midst of sin? This week, look for it. Look for God's restoring care for you and I. Hope you enjoyed week's worth. We're continuing to go through the walk of the Bible as Genesis chapter 3, and now we're going to go to Genesis chapter 4, and so on and so forth. If this is helpful for you, and I hope it is, you can subscribe. We do these every week, so we hope that you would continue looking out for these different episodes. Hope you join us next time on Week's Worth.